There was an initial OpenAI paper that was released that basically said, we measured how the model conformed to our predetermined set of values, essentially saying that they had these intentional procedures for changing the political bias of their AIs. And same thing with Google, where Google in their paper said not only points to specific data sets that they use to control the political valence of their model of Gemini, but also said that the responsible AI team was put together based on standards set by the Biden executive order. So I worry that conservatives get lost fighting the last war, essentially. I think that AI is the, censorship issue of the decade, if not the century, that this is where, the effort to censor politically inconvenient information is moving. And I really hope that, there's less of that censorship.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and this week it is just me. I thought it's very important for Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month to have a conversation with just two Asians. I'm kidding, of course, but we had on today a fantastic guest, Brian Chau, who is the executive director of the Alliance for the Future. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. In the meantime, be sure to go to americanmoment.org. There you can find signups for all of our programs. We've got our summer AM Fridays lecture series on Capitol Hill coming up, free Chick-fil-A and fantastic speakers, a fall fellowship for American Statecraft. This is the year we're running it year round. Our spring class just graduated. All of them have jobs, or I think all but one of them have jobs, or I'm sure he'll get one too. And our summer class is about to start, so come join us in the fall, right before hopefully the next administration comes into office. And you can also go to nationalconservatism.org. NatCon 4 is in Washington, D.C. on July 8th, 9th, and 10th. We would love to see all of our friends there. Today, I had on Brian Chau, who's the executive director of Alliance for the Future. Brian has a background in pure mathematics and has won international awards in computer science. He's a former machine learning engineer and the current author of the AI Pluralism newsletter, a popular newsletter on artificial intelligence. I met Brian actually at a National Conservatism conference a couple of years ago, and he's since become a very interesting sort of elite follow on Twitter, I guess now known as X. If you're interested in AI and technology in the intersection between what's going on the cutting edge of Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C., he is someone you should be following. His board is stacked with a bunch of fantastic leaders in this space, including our friend John Askinas. And look, American Moment's priority, I think it's maybe number 8, is that technological progress is crucial for national prosperity. We believe that AI getting deployed en masse is going to be good for our interests politically and civilizationally. Obviously, it needs some light guardrails around it. And so figuring out what those are prophylactically, as opposed to trying to undo the garbage the left is going to try to do over the course of the next decade, is extremely important. So we had a fantastic wide-ranging discussion on Brian's background, what AFTF does, the competitive landscape in both policy and in the commercial sector on AI. It was a ton of fun, so listen to the end, and we'll go now to Brian Chau. Brian, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Great to be here.
We always like to hear about how our guests got to where they are today. You have a pretty unusual background. You didn't come up through the traditional world of rarefied public policy. Tell us your story. How did you end up here in DC? It's a pretty interesting tale.
Right. So it's a long story. So I run Alliance for the Future here in DC, which is pro-AI nonprofit. But how that all got started is how I ended up learning about AI in the first place. So basically in middle school, I was very involved with competitive programming. So if you've seen the meme about, the US Math Olympiad team beats the Chinese Math Olympiad team, I basically fit that stereotype.
Because the US Math Olympiad team is all people with the same names as the Chinese Math Olympiad team.
Yeah. So my family's from Hong Kong, immigrated to the US. And the contest programming scene is essentially like very similar to the Math Olympiad scene. It's like basically the same people. They all know each other. And I ended up being, so I grew up in Canada. I'm an American citizen, but grew up in Canada. And while I was in middle school in Canada, I ended up at the time being the youngest person to make nationals for competitive programming, and then eventually, still, I believe, tied for the youngest to win a gold medal at the International Olympiad in Informatics, which is like the world version of competitive programming. And that's how I ended up being exposed to a lot of machine learning, because essentially these contests were trying to solve these hard technical problems in a short time frame. And if you were interested in solving hard technical problems in industry, odds are you're going to end up at a machine learning company. So there was very direct kind of recruitment pipelines of trying to teach all of these competitive programmers more concepts in machine learning, which was still a relatively early field at that time. And that's how I ended up hearing about, all of these technologies that would end up leading into something like ChatGPT.
So when people do these sort of competitive programming competitions stuff, do they actually end up even going to college, or do they go straight into industry if they're very competitive?
So this is actually a while ago, someone asked me what my biggest regret was. And that probably is going to college, because so I had the thought in my mind that after doing this, after doing competitive programming and getting to the international level, I had learned it not well more than was necessary for an undergraduate computer science degree. So I thought, instead I'll do a degree in pure math. And I do think that was, I did learn things about pure math, but I think that most people who are successful in competitive programming end up in the same situation as me, where they don't really need to do a college degree. They could just go straight into industry, or they could start their own startup. But most of them, I would say, still do end up going to college, just because it's the thing to do.
And so after you went to college, what did you end up doing?
Right. So I ended up working in a few machine learning startups right after getting out of college. And then this is what later led me to starting Alliance for the Future. At the same time, I was starting to pay more attention to politics. This was essentially during the COVID era. I became really interested in this phenomenon, that I've since learned I'm not the first to observe, where many people in politics do not get promoted based on whether their solutions work. Activists, politicians, regulators, a lot of the time, whether what happens to their job can often actually benefit from either not solving the problem or from actually making the problem worse. And so, as every young man curious about politics does, I started a newsletter, I started a podcast. I interviewed many people, actually, who you've also interviewed. John Askonis, who's now on our board, Josh Steinman. We both recently interviewed Jeremy Carl, and ended up getting connected to DC and policy world through that. Now, you fast forward to the end of 2022, where ChatGPT is released, and we just started seeing all these crazy headlines in the news. Is AI going to, kill all of humanity, so on. And I was hearing from policy people that actually, these, quote unquote doomers were very well funded, that they were actually getting audiences here in DC, not like public audiences, but, audiences with regulators, with elected representatives, so on. And that this was a really important problem to address, because I thought, this was kind of like being a nuclear engineer in the 60s or 70s, right? You had a bright, promising career ahead of you. You were at the cutting edge of an industry. You were probably going to be able to do a lot of new research and engineering on brand new projects. And then, under Nixon, he passed the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or created the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which proceeded to only approve, I believe, one permit now recently in all of its existence. So it was very plausible that, that nuclear engineer would have gotten a lot more done if he had pivoted to, policy, at least temporarily, and not be so kind of singularly focused on just the technology itself. And I thought that I was in a similar situation where I wanted to secure, this research area going on into the future, and was just very concerned about this kind of policy direction that things were taking in DC.
Very interesting. So, Alliance for the Future is the organization. Tell us a little bit about its structure and what its activities are, and then we can dive deep into all the policy fights that are going on at once right now.
Right. So we're a 501c4. I think someone who doesn't like us called us like the nerve center of accelerationism, where, it's a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true. Silicon Valley and DC don't really talk to each other. So, I have a technical background. I also became much more informed in policy through, meeting many people in our similar circles. And the problem that I think we really solve is providing a kind of fine-grained understanding of AI, where right now people are thinking about AI in very broad generalizations. They're not looking at, specific categories of AI, specific types of AI, and having basically a deep understanding of the underlying issue. And so there's two direct problems that we're trying to address here. One is by providing kind of a sane policy alternative to address, 90% of the problems of AI, the kind of real problems of AI, without destroying the entire industry or without imposing a new wave of censorship. Although, some people, want that as the end goal. And the second problem that we're trying to address is really bridging this Silicon Valley DC divide, where I think that we're able. This is something that we've succeeded to doing already, creating a kind of grassroots reaction among startups, among venture capital, among some medium-sized companies against some of these policies, and really bringing a kind of coordinated effort of when to actually use those resources, when to actually take a stand on some kind of policy, and directing that effort in a kind of focused, centralized way.
Very interesting. So I guess there's been a lot of policy development on these issues since ChatGPT first came out. I remember we did a lot of content around it when it felt like this was the topic du jour. But the technology keeps progressing and rapidly. What happened this week, or the week before when this publishes, was the release of ChatGPT 4.5. Just handicap the state of that technology right now. What new was showcased in that demonstration that you think is interesting, and what it tells us about the state of the industry right now?
Right. So the kind of big public feature unroll that they did there was this kind of voice interface and a desktop app that should be out soon. They basically presented it like it was basically going to be released imminently, but we're still waiting a few days on that. But basically that these were interfaces that made it much easier to use ChatGPT. And that's where I think this technology is really going, where there was some speculation that it's just going to become better and better at answering questions, at providing these complex answers. And that's really not the direction we're seeing companies take it, where there's some maybe marginal improvements, there's some small fixes, but the direction that they're really taking it is making it much easier to use, making it much more expansive. And I think this is something that actually gets overlooked by many people covering the new OpenAI announcement, is making it dramatically cheaper and faster and essentially more convenient to use. And that's where I think the real kind of lane of competition is going to go to now between all of these big players.
Can you just explain a little bit about what the competitive landscape right now is? It's, again, I'm someone who's sort of adjacent to, interested in this stuff, but not paying attention to it every day. So it's like, what's Llama? What's Claude? It feels like there's all these different platforms. ChatGPT has become sort of the Xerox of the industry. It's the brand name that people use to describe the product. But that doesn't seem like it's actually reflective of the actual competitive landscape. What does it actually look like out there right now?
Right. So what's fascinating to me is I think that people have overlearned the last story about tech. The last story about tech was, social media, winner takes all, network effects, that, it was going to be a natural monopoly. And I think that people are preemptively applying the same ideas to ChatGPT or to other machine learning companies, other AI companies. And to me, that's far from true. It may end up being the case that, through regulatory measures or through kind of just through execution, one company ends up taking a dominant market share. But right now, and in my opinion, there's a fair chance that this is still going to be true in the future, the AI market is incredibly competitive. That, yeah, as you said, there are all these larger companies such as OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, Meta, so on. Apple recently announced that it's doubling down on investments, although they're not quite at the product stage yet, or sorry, like the public product stage yet, where there's both kind of ongoing competition between existing players, and there's a lot of investment in new up-and-coming companies, startups that may take down these larger players. Both of those are kind of very flourishing areas of competition right now.
So just describe some of the other main stage players and sort of handicap how competitive you think they're going to be in the medium term.
Right. So I would say that it's interesting because you're already seeing these different niches being carved out. There's overall performance, where I think ChatGPT is still in the lead. Basically, how well the quality of the answers, I still think OpenAI is in the lead there. And I would say following closely behind it is Anthropic. And then the curious thing about Meta is that its largest model is actually not yet released yet, the 405 billion version. Essentially, the larger the model, the more expensive it is, but also the more accurate you can expect it to be. So that one's not released yet, but we expect it to be, at a similar level to Anthropic. So basically, one pace behind ChatGPT, and then two paces behind would be probably Google. And you have some other companies such as Mistral in France, who might also be kind of 2 or 3 paces behind in terms of overall performance. Now there's a different lane here, which is essentially cost per performance. So you have both the highest level models, but each of these companies also release smaller models, smaller versions of their AI that are much cheaper to run, that are much cheaper to build, to train, essentially, and at the same time are also much cheaper for the user, right? These lower costs get passed on to the user, and if they're looking to solve a kind of very simple, straightforward problem without spending a ton of money, then this is a kind of different lane for them to be going after.
So what do you think? I mean, Anthropic, for instance, has gotten like tens of billions of dollars of funding at this point, right? Like what competitive edge can it possibly hope for over something like ChatGPT? Are they seeking to innovate on technology, training sources, price? Like what exactly is going on there?
So Anthropic has been, I think, fairly closed about what its research goals, what like specific research techniques it's looking for, right? And for good reason, right? Because you don't want to tip these things off to your competitors. But I think most of these large organizations are still mostly focused on competing at a kind of research level now. That might be driving down the cost. That might be trying to create even better answers, higher quality answers. I think that only a few are looking at distribution. And I think that it's interesting to me because it might be the case that, we saw for a short moment when Claude 3 released that Anthropic ended up like narrowly surpassing OpenAI on some of these specific measures of performance, right? So they managed to put out a model that was kind of slightly better on some technical requirements. And this ended up basically not really affecting usership at all. And there's this interesting split screen where it might be the case that the company's more focused on distribution. Google, Meta, Microsoft through OpenAI trying to distribute OpenAI's technology through its own products, where those kind of legacy players might actually might just have the edge in terms of distribution, and as long as their technology is kind of competitive in the same way, they end up winning by default because they just got the audience first.
There's been a couple of waves of major public policy proposals that have affected the AI industry. The big one to start was the Biden AI executive order It's been out for a couple of months now, it feels like. Tell us what some of the early effects that you guys have started to see from that. Is it as bad as the EAC guys thought it was, or has it been more measured? Is administration serious about it? What's going on?
Right. So we passed, I believe, the 90-day benchmark, the 180-day benchmark very recently. And we saw these reports getting put out by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NTIA, National Telecommunications something agency. They're just called the NTIA. So essentially what the pipeline looks like is that Biden signs this executive order. These executive agencies process them in some way, try to accomplish these goals in some way, create these reports, and these reports essentially get implemented as actions done by these agencies. Something that's very worrisome to me is not necessarily the executive agency's impact on companies, which for now still seems to be quite limited, but instead the impact that they're having exactly on this day, right now, on the government's ability to adopt AI. Some of these new procurement standards from NIST, essentially standards related to what kind of AI the government can actually adopt, can actually buy and use internally, is very destructive to our ability to kind of keep up as a national government. I think that the right framework for thinking about government use of AI is this kind of great power competition, right, between the US and China, where China is not afraid to both strategically fund AI, strategically fund manufacturing of chips that are specifically used for AI, that move quickly on this, and we need a kind of matching speed. And if there are many things that I think the American system does much better than the Chinese system. Certainly, I'm very grateful for the American system, but one of those things is not speed in adopting technologies within the government. And I think the directives coming out of the Office of Management of the Budget, as well as out of NIST, are sort of shooting yourself in the foot before the race has even started.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about the dichotomy between the American approach to AI and the Chinese one. I think it's sometimes very easy these days to overestimate Chinese state capacity and their ability to actually deliver on these things. When it comes to the most cutting edge technologies, especially, I think it's very much an open question. Is there anything visible from across the pond right now about how the Chinese are approaching this and if they're having any success?
Right. So we did see a few models released. I forget exactly their names, that are kind of competitive with the 2 or 3 steps back models released in the States. The common phrase that gets tossed around is that China is 2 to 3 years behind America in terms of deployment of language models, stuff like ChatGPT. And I think that assessment is pretty accurate.
Why? Why are they so behind?
So it's interesting because on an academic level, they seem to be quite competitive or even exceed the West, exceed the US in terms of just publishing, new research, new material. Where they really struggle is with commercializing it, actually engineering, putting together the product, taking the kind of theoretical research and turning it into something like ChatGPT. And that's something where they seem to struggle. And that might be probably due to broader economic factors, like, what the Chinese startup ecosystem is like, the kind of heavy-handed top-down approach that they have. This kind of really detailed, thorough, and dynamic engineering, engineering not just based on, a fixed goal of, say, getting a product to, increase efficiency, although that's part of it, but also making these more qualitative judgments seems to be something that the Chinese market is still quite bad at.
Yeah. Do you think they have any likelihood of catching up?
I think that at the current pace of U.S. development, that is very unlikely. I think that if the U.S. takes an approach, if the U.S. government takes an approach of, once again, shooting themselves in the foot, of making the environment worse in the United States, worse than possibly even than China, as I think the EU has done, then it's a very real possibility. I mean, just look at the split screen right now, actually. You can look at the split screen between the EU and China, where the EU was a much tighter regulatory environment beforehand. The current pace of EU development, most specifically Mistral, which is the leading company, which is based in France, leading company in the EU, that was in the previous regulatory regime. And they passed this new AI Act that would essentially make it much harder for Mistral to operate and much harder for new companies to even get to that point where they're established, where they're working at the frontier. So I think that if you look at the split screen of Europe being somewhat behind China when it comes to language models and very behind China in terms of these other applications that China is better at, you can see that it is possible to shoot yourself in the foot. It is possible to, through poorly thought out regulation, toss this lead that we have back to China.
Yeah. People talk about open source versus closed source AI all the time. What does that mean, and does it matter?
Right. So there's a long tradition in software of saying that many of these tools that we develop, this is software that can basically be infinitely copied, essentially for free. We're going to publish online. So you can take this code that we publish online. You yourself can run it. Usually there's some kind of license, copyright attached to it. You can only use it for specific purposes, or use it. You have to give credit. You have to you have to cite your sources, so on. But essentially, that you can use all the software that we developed and just basically post it online. Mm-hmm. And that is what is called open source. And then closed source is just the opposite, right? We're going to hide our code. We're not going to publish our code. We're going to, copyright our code so that, I forget if it's copyright or trademark, but we're going to, try to get a legal designation for our code so that other people can't use it. We're going to try very hard to keep it essentially a kind of trade secret. So that's open source, that's closed source, and open source is the one that you publish online.
Got it. It seems like there is a growing policy divide that is overlapping and related to entrepreneurs that prefer open source versus closed source approach to AI. Can you just describe that territory and that scene? Seems like the A16Z people like open source. Seems like people call OpenAI closed AI. What's going on there? What's the meta politics undergirding it?
Yeah. So this is a very funny misnomer. OpenAI was initially committed to kind of open sourcing their code, but has since gone back on that, and so people call them closed AI, because they kind of are. It's the moniker is sort of correct. As to the broader landscape, there is a lot of passion around defending open source because it's seen as, I think correctly seen as, this organic upswell. A lot of developers get their start, a lot of basically software engineers get their start building open source projects because, anyone can contribute. As long as you take the code, you publish it online on sites like GitHub. If people like it, then they can use it. It is this very free-spirited and open environment. And so when that comes under fire, I think there's a kind of special anger. In general, developers don't like a lot of the legislation that's coming up, but when it's targeted towards open source, there's a particular ire that draws, where it's like, are you guys this ungrateful? Because a lot of open source software is a lot more secure because it's exposed to a lot more testing, because simply more people can test it, and you get all of these kind of positive benefits from open source. And so when laws like, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, SB 1047 are passed, that essentially impose very harsh liabilities to companies whose code can be copied, essentially targeting open source, there's just a huge backlash against it.
Yeah. What's the sort of commercial interest undergirding? Like, why would a set of companies or financial interests want to see the industry go in a more open source direction for purely pecuniary reasons?
This is just fascinating. I can see it from both ends, where there is some incentive towards open source. Some companies want open source, most notably Meta, and then some companies want closed source as well. I think OpenAI, Anthropic are more in this direction. So let's go on the open source angle first. Like, why would Meta want to open source? And I think that it's a combination of two things. One is being less confident in their research lead, essentially thinking that it's going to be a long-term competitive market that really what's called the special the greatest returns to their investment are not going to be at the research level. What level is it going to be instead? I think the answer that they have is the distribution level. So if they're going and publishing their models open source, which is what they're doing, right? This is the current Meta policy. They published Llama 3 open source, at least the small and medium versions of it, and they've committed to publishing the large version of it when it's finished. Then that becomes a kind of baseline. That becomes the undergirding layer to a lot of AI tools that are built on top of that. Mm-hmm. And now if all of those tools are built on top of essentially technology that was developed by Meta that they particularly understand, that maybe they build to be integrated with their other products, then that distribution flows very naturally. So if they can get developers to be operating off of a framework that works very naturally with their other products, right, then where will those companies go for distribution? Where will those companies go to sell their product, to kind of integrate their product with other tools? Well, it will go to, I think this is what Meta hopes for, it will go to their products.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about the fight in DC right now. It seems like Chuck Schumer has been having a lot of meetings for the last year and a half, 18 months on this topic. What is he cooking up? What's the AI framework that it seems like he's going to be championing for the coming years?
Very timely news, because his AI roadmap just came out today, and I actually think that it's kind of optimistic shift. So he essentially ran these listening sessions, these hearings with a lot of top CEOs of all of these AI companies and many other representatives from both those companies and others and other organizations. And he came up with this roadmap. And this roadmap basically says we need to have a lot more public spending on AI, and something that's encouraging to me is on not just kind of language models, but on the kind of more broader diverse range of applications of AI, right? Whether that's in biotechnology, in medicine, in manufacturing, in agriculture, right? I think they call it science, medicine, and agriculture by name in the roadmap. And so it's taking an approach that's you can agree with this or disagree with this, that's much more focused on kind of investing and kind of government funding more AI development rather than restricting it. And something else that I thought was very optimistic was their approach to national security, because I think that there are these two dueling camps in national security right now that are basically saying, are we going to think of AI technology in terms of the war on terror or in terms of great power competition? I mentioned this briefly before, where China is a real threat. They are at least close. Some of these other competitors, Russia, Iran, I don't think are remotely close in terms of technology, but China can compete, has shown its ability to compete, and can also very much compete on the kind of hardware level, on the industrial scale. And of course, there are risks with Taiwan as well. And we should be looking at AI as a broader part of this great power competition. Now, the dueling framework that I think happens on the other side of that is the kind of war on terror framework. There were these concerns that actually have since been rolled back about, will AI be used to build a bioweapon? Will AI be used to, will AI be used to essentially kill humanity? Be used as this kind of new weapon of mass destruction? That this was something that was a narrative that was very well funded, that was, pushed through some of these established organizations, such as CSET or CNAS. And I was very worried whether Schumer's report would take this kind of war on terror approach to AI. And from my reading of it, it seems that that's not the case, that they're really kind of all in on this great power competition approach, which in my opinion is the correct approach.
Yeah. What is in there in terms of the regulatory guidelines that Schumer would like to see? Why do you think if you had to, peek behind the curtain, why do you think his approach seems to differ so vastly from how the Biden administration has approached the issue?
Yes, so I would say the Biden administration is kind of divided both ways on this, where, for example, in NIST, they do have more of this kind of global war on terror, kind of, quote unquote, doomer contingent, such as Paul Cristiano at NIST, but also has some of the great competition elements, right? So I would say he's more kind of split 50-50. I would say that the main difference here is really a difference in time, because we saw, many of these organizations actually roll back their claims about, AI bioweapons or whatever, which I think are not credible, and they themselves increasingly think are at least overrated compared to what they thought before, if not, also not credible. So I think that over time, as companies themselves, as well as just ordinary engineers, people like myself, people who may have somewhat of a social media following, people who are just kind of policy wonks or interested in the issue, as they get more exposure to the underlying technology, as they are just more generally better informed, then this kind of special lobbying effort by the doomers to kind of set the stage before anyone knows really doesn't work anymore. And so I think it's less a kind of, there's an angle here of like, what's the difference between Schumer and Biden, which I don't think is the correct way to think about it. I think the correct way to think about it is, what's the difference between now and I believe, last October? And I think that difference is actually tangible. I can feel it even in my conversations with representatives and their staff.
Yeah. How is the other side operating in this environment? You mentioned earlier that the AI doomers are a faction. They're very well funded and organized. Just describe a little bit of how their approach has gone and why they have been effective at getting some things out of, say, the Biden administration.
Yes, so the doomers are funded by essentially Dustin Moskowitz, Facebook co-founder, and formerly Sam Bankman-Fried of FTX. I'm not sure if he's still funding them from jail. I would hope not. But they really spent hundreds of millions of dollars essentially trying to create a narrative and trying to do what's called entryism, right? To try to place people who are aligned with their kind of political faction, their policy beliefs in key positions on committees with regulators or with senator or representative offices. And there was this really kind of explicit laid out campaign. New York Weissblatt has great reporting on this to essentially do a bait and switch to say, we're very concerned about the deepfakes. We're very concerned about about the cybersecurity risks, which I think are actual risks. But the bait and switch is to take this reasonable risk and say, once they're actually in conversations about what the policy is should do in law, to instead pivot to these kind of fears about AI extinction. And so those combinations of being very well funded and essentially like concealing their actual policy beliefs were, I think, the key to their success so far. And both of those things are becoming less tenable because SBF, we all know what happened there. FTX went bankrupt. He was convicted of fraud, and hopefully is no longer doing this funding. As well as people become more informed, it becomes harder to hide both their actual policy beliefs or to kind of give the impression that these kind of extreme measures are really just addressed at the deepfakes and the cybersecurity risk. That becomes something that's increasingly not tenable for them.
Yeah. This fight's going to be fought on a lot of different levels, internationally, nationally, but also at the state level. What's going on in the states, and specifically what's going on in California when it comes to AI regulation?
Right. So there's this big bill that we're really leading a surprisingly wide effort on, which is SB 1047. So what is SB 1047? It is this bill introduced in the California Senate that has a variety of sweeping measures against AI. One is that it was create this frontier model division, essentially a new regulatory agency within the California, I think, Department of Technology, and they would fund this by imposing just blanket fees on AI companies. So already kind of, something that would hurt startups much more than established players. Now, what makes matters worse is what this frontier model division would actually do. I think the most concerning part of its operations, there are certainly many other concerns that I have and other people have with it, but the most dangerous thing is how it defines derivative models. So it says, basically, if there's a large cyber attack or a large biological attack, so on, or a large, I think they say, equivalent crime if a person committed it, right? So this is targeting something like fraud. Then all derivative models would be held, developers resulting in derivative models would be held accountable. Now, what does that mean? I'm trying to remember the quote exactly off the top of my head here, but a derivative model is, this is almost exactly the text, a model modified or unmodified, or this is a second section, a model used in combination with other software. So if you've ever used a piece of software, something like Gmail, you know that it works with your browser, it works with the email server, it works with all of these other pieces of technology that are essentially stacked on top of each other. And AI is no different. But what this derivative model clause would mean is that if an open source developer publishes an open source model and a malicious actor uses that in combination with other software, even if the original software is, perfectly fine, even if the original AI model is perfectly fine, then that developer could be held liable. Essentially, let's say you took an AI that just writes emails, it says, "Hi, I'm Brian, it's nice to meet you, please book a time on my calendar." Perfectly legitimate use of AI. And if a malicious actor takes this and instead of, giving a calendar link, gives a malware link, gives a phishing link, right? That the original developer of the AI itself, so not the hacker, not the malicious actor, but the person who just made the email AI, could be held liable under this law. And this overwrought, this incredibly broad definition of derivative model is exactly what makes this bill so dangerous to open source.
Do you think that kind of knock-on effect from that legislation is intentional or unintentional on behalf of the legislative production process?
It's very nice that you specified that part at the end, because I think it's intentional among some people and unintentional among others. So California Senator Scott Wiener, who is the sponsor of this bill in the California Senate, I'm actually not sure that it's intentional, or I would err on the side that it's unintentional from him. Mm-hmm. He's a very busy guy. He's obviously, a state senator. But where I think it is intentional is with some of the nonprofits co-sponsoring this bill. The, quote unquote, Center for AI Safety, which is funded by Dustin Moskowitz, funded by Open Philanthropy, which is this kind of explicitly doomer org, this org that explicitly believes that AI, will cause human extinction. I think that they are intentionally, when they are involved with writing this bill, they're intentionally trying to essentially crack down on AI development and open source development as much as they can. So in short, I think that on the state Senate level, it's mostly it's more ignorance than malice. But on the side of these nonprofits, it's much more malice.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting to me about this political fight is that in most big policy fights, there are financial interests on both sides of the ledger. This is one of the rare fights in politics where there's financial interest on one side and almost none on the other, and it's more of a sort of moral, theological view.
I don't think that's true.
Okay, so that's what I was going to ask. What's the financial interest for AI doomerism? Like, why do they support it?
The kind of total bans, I think there's less of a direct financial interest, but I think there's definitely a financial interest in shutting out competitors.
Okay,
many of these companies, I think, are worried about startups just coming out of nowhere and overtaking them, and especially if you're OpenAI or if you're Anthropic, and you have these kind of leads in compliance. This is actually a strategy, famously, pioneered by Sam Bankman-Fried. He says this explicitly in the what was it, the Michael Lewis biography? It was one of the biographies where he said, we're going to go in and we're going to advocate for regulation of our own industry. He was, of course, in crypto, not AI. But what that meant was essentially, and he explicitly laid it out, he said, this is going to make regulators more friendly to us, and it's going to mean that we have a lead in complying with these regulations while our competitors don't. And I think that, maybe I would hope that, effective altruists have learned the lesson from Sam Bankman-Fried of not committing fraud. But I don't think, I think that they've learned exactly the opposite lesson when it comes to advocating for regulation, where if you create these barriers to entry, especially, this is why I think there's more targeting of open source, because open source is particularly useful to startups because they get more flexibility with modifying their AI. I think that there's a huge anti-competitive effect from these laws, where it's much easier for these large companies to comply than it is for startups. And I know many of these startup founders myself. I think it would be very hard for them to comply. And, regardless of whether this is, once again, I think the legislators are not necessarily aware of this. They're not kind of twirling their mustache and saying, we want to give OpenAI a regulatory monopoly. That's not what's going through their heads, at least not the heads of, I think, the legislators. But I think that's the kind of practical effect.
What is the commercial coordination looking like these days on this one? So, for instance, I remember seeing, I think it was the Department of Homeland Security released what its like AI governance board was going to be, and it had the CEOs of a bunch of these top players. But if you had to describe the teams, so to speak, you got OpenAI and who else on one side, and what's the other side look like in terms of the big commercial players that you think will have a shaping role in public policy here?
Yeah, so OpenAI and Anthropic, I believe, have both advocated for kind of a licensing scheme or a kind of pre-testing scheme where a government regulator has to test and approve AI before it's released. Sam Altman testified to that effect in front of Congress. So I think that they're most extreme when it comes to advocating for this kind of anti-competitive legislation or anti-competitive regulatory process. I think Google is somewhere in the middle, and then Meta and Mistral have been more against it. Mistral more so in the EU because they're in France, but have been fighting more so for the open source. Of course, they put their money where their mouth is by releasing these open source models, unlike closed AI, and have been fighting more for this essentially more kind of pluralistic approach.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about what some of those other technical or applications of large language models or AI in general might be that, policy people in Washington, they're obsessed with ChatGPT. That's the only AI application they're paying very close attention to. What are some of the upcoming AI innovations that you think are going to all at once be on people's policy horizon that they should be aware of and paying attention to?
Yeah, I think that the mainstream is, in terms of machine learning research, is kind of right on this, where I think ChatGPT is flashy, it's easy to deploy, right? It's just a website, but some of these more complicated applications take longer. So applications in medicine, there's already applications in speeding up drug research, because a lot of drug research requires essentially careful synthesis and variation of drugs, these kind of biological processes. And AI is something that can help model those, essentially simulate them without doing them in reality in a much more accurate way than previous simulations. So essentially speeding up the research process, making things easier and cheaper for drug discovery, drug development. And I think, going to practically make things cheaper and hopefully, create some new cures for people. There are some already implemented improvements in terms of diagnosis, right? Cancer diagnosis, detecting tumors early, either from blood samples or from scans, or so on. That's a practical effect where I think AI is translating into, people's lives being saved. And another big area, which I think was mentioned in the Schumer roadmap as well, is agriculture, because AI, there are these, I believe agriculture is the kind of, cause for the initial book of statistics, right? That the initial book on statistics, is kind of ancient, relic that was preserved, was essentially like a guide to farming. And that's why they developed all of these statistical approaches. There's a lot of uncertainty that goes into farming when it comes to kind of soil nutrients, when it comes to when exactly crops are ripe, in helping picking and collecting them, that there are tons of AI applications for. So this is something that I'm encouraged by as well, seeing essentially agricultural interests become much more involved in actually promoting use of AI technology, because that's what they're using.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting because I think I'm basically pro AI. I think that the upsides of the technology are going to far outweigh the downsides, but it is very important, I think, to be realistic and prepared for what the real risks of AI are. In your estimation, what are the aspects of AI where we actually do need thoughtful regulation to avoid some of the tail end risk that can be associated with the new technology?
So something I worry about is if the AI race essentially becomes much less a factor of, large concentrated research and more on specialized distributed research. What do I mean by that? Right now, how good your AI is, at least for these kind of broader within government approaches, are very dependent on the leading companies. So OpenAI, Google, Anthropic, Meta, so on. And right now, that means we have a lead. But if it becomes something much more specialized, if it becomes, say, that investment in specialized cybersecurity AI becomes more important, direct investment in those areas and direct government-driven research in those areas becomes more important than just, how good your general AI companies are. This is something that can be much more easily lost to China. Like I said, I believe in the great power competition approach. I believe that's the right framing for this. And if that becomes something where it's, can China better invest strategically in cybersecurity AI than America? I think that question is, up in the air. We don't know the answers to that question. And so it might be the case that that becomes more of a risk for us to fall behind China as AI becomes more specialized. So in order to address this problem, I think that one of the most important portfolios I'm working on is modernization of government, both modernization of government with AI and in relation to AI, essentially fixing what rules the US government can actually use when adopting AI tools for themselves.
That's pretty interesting. I guess, do you have any commentary on, runaway intelligent AI that improves itself? Is that a real risk that you worry about? My sense is that it's a shiny object that public policymakers should really have no ability to control, even if it is possible. And so how do you think about that?
Yeah. This idea of kind of infinite self-improvement. I have a short article at AF Future. That's our organization's website, affuture.org/research, about this, which is essentially this idea of, infinite self-improvement, infinite research improvement only comes from a total ignorance of history, where every single scientific field we've had, physics, biology, chemistry, has eventually gotten to the point of diminishing returns, where new scientific breakthroughs are harder and harder to find. Now, this doesn't mean that physics, chemistry, biology isn't actually impactful, right? This is, I think, critics of AI go too far, where they say, it's not going to be useful at all. But it does mean that as you build more and more intelligent AI, you're going to get a slowdown in how much new research you can get because you've picked all of the low-hanging fruit. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing with a lot of the developments in AI, even currently, where there was a kind of, speculation, less so based on the underlying research and more so based on, OpenAI press releases, that we're just going to keep getting, better and better models at the same rate as, going from GPT-3 to GPT 3.5 when they released ChatGPT, right? So they had this big product release. People thought, they're just going to keep following it up. They somewhat followed it up with GPT-4, which was a notable improvement. And then, since then have been kind of really slow rolling it. And I think that that's just a natural consequence of, something that's happened in every scientific field. And really how these kind of doomers came to it is that they come from this kind of blogging movement that really doesn't take kind of scientific or precedents or historical precedent very seriously. And so I think that it's a very crazy assertion that, that this research technology is just going to keep going. There's going to be infinite amounts of research. That's something that's not precedented in all of history. And that's something that, it doesn't matter if it's a human doing the research or an AI assisting with the research. It's something that, you're going to hit diminishing returns.
Conservatives tend to be really bad at technical matters, especially technical matters related to public policy. And so they try to fit, square peg into the round hole of whatever they're on about at any moment. That being said, is woke AI something we should worry about? The use of these tools and the feeding of these tools information related to, our prevailing regime ideology that could be injurious to conservative political interests.
Right. This is something that I think you've seen. You've certainly seen with Gemini. You've seen in the early stages of ChatGPT that essentially it's strongly implied that there is already government coordination in order to direct the kind of political ideology of these AI tools. This is something that I think is, at least for conservatives, a much more serious policy concern. Where so I actually did the kind of original reporting on this because no one else, in conservative journalism actually reads the papers. That in the there was an initial OpenAI paper that was released that basically said, I believe the exact quote was, we measured how the model conformed to our predetermined set of values, essentially saying that they had these intentional procedures for changing the political bias of their AIs, and that this was basically that this was intentional. And in their announcements when ChatGPT released and the people caught the political bias, they were saying, no, this was honest. This is just an accident. This maybe was a problem in our data. Just not true. Just completely false. And same thing with Google, where Google in their paper said not only points to specific data sets that they use to control the political valence of their model of Gemini, but also said that the responsible AI team was put together based on standards set by the Biden executive order. So there was essentially saying that this was designed to address, specifically these concerns laid out by the executive order. So I worry that conservatives get lost fighting the last war, essentially. I think that AI is the, censorship issue of the decade, if not the century, that this is where, the effort to censor politically inconvenient information is moving. And I really hope that, there's less of that censorship.
One thing that I think is very interesting about what you're doing is you're trying to ameliorate that bridge between Silicon Valley world and Washington, D.C. I love technologists. I think they're often some of the most interesting people we have, and they're great innovators. But the one thing that they always are tempted by the idea of innovating themselves out of, but always fail at, is human nature, i.e. politics. I'm curious, what's your handicap at this point? How do you think about the tech industry as a whole? How savvy are they on politics? Are they getting better? And what do they most misunderstand about our political process?
I do think that they're getting better. In a large part, the question is less so on understanding and more so on caring at all. Mm-hmm. Where many, even major tech companies were caught basically completely flat-footed when it came to policy. They just did not, they just did not worry about it. This is something just to be put off for later. This was not something that was central to them. And, I understand how you might come to that scenario because they're very busy, they're managing their day-to-day, and they don't see how threatening this policy could be to their company, even if it's already on the horizon. And I think that's how something like SB 1047 happened. But I do think, I am somewhat optimistic about this, where I think that the capability for rapid response is developing, right? I still think that they're mostly going to be reactive, but instead of being like ineffectively reactive, they're going to be, semi-effectively reactive, which I think is a big step, where, quite frankly, they're paying attention to people like me. They're paying attention to other people in tech policy, maybe, right of center tech policy. And they're essentially saying, like, this is something at least worth paying attention to. Maybe we're not going to be digging into it proactively. We're not going to go out of our way to promote our plan. But if something is happening, we want to stay in the loop. And I think that's the kind of next step in kind of becoming more aware, even on my own personal journey, right? I'm not sure if the analogy is right here, but, let's go with it for now anyway. That, when I first started paying attention to politics, the first thing that I thought was not, I really need to be writing stuff and giving my takes. My first foray into it was just, I need to find out what's going on. I need to pay attention to these things. I need to figure out what actually matters, what's noise. And I think that that's a kind of natural, healthy improvement.
We're going to go now to our members only segment, where I'm going to ask Brian a bunch of spicy questions about, why are Asians overrepresented in Math Olympiad, as well as the things he's actually worried about on the horizon and some of the dumbest things he's heard while doing this work. In order to become a member, you can go to our YouTube channel. You can become a member of our YouTube channel under the categories of Truther or Statesman. You get the episodes 24 hours early on Sunday, as well as these special members only clips. So be sure to go to our YouTube channel to subscribe to that. All right, Brian. If you're listening to this, you're almost certainly a highly sophisticated news consumer, but even the most dogged of DC politicos need a news aggregator to help them out. We're big fans of Upward News here at American Moment. Ari David has actually been a previous guest on this show. We highly recommend you check out that episode. But Upward.news is a way that our team keeps in touch with all of the crazy news stories going on around the world. Your Twitter feed is not necessarily 100% reliable to get a proper cross-section of everything going on that matters. Upward News is a fantastic young media startup that is really putting together fantastic newsletters and social media content that helps people digest the news, especially if you're tired of being on the phone with your parents and explaining news stories to them multiple times a week because you're the politico in the family. I highly recommend encouraging them to follow Upward.news. They do a free 5-minute daily email that you can sign up for at readupward.com, or even better, www.ihatefakenews.com. It's time for a palate cleanse from politicos, punch bowls, and pucks. Try Upward News today. We highly recommend it. Ari's an incredibly smart patriot, and they're a new player on the block focused on cutting through the noise and delivering smart analysis. Please check them out. Brian, how can people keep up with everything that you're doing and find the organization you now run?
Right. So organization is Alliance for the Future, AFT Future on X, and AF Future, 2 Fs, affuture.org for the organization's website. And you can find me personally. You can reach out by email at Chow, CHAU, at affuture.org. Or you can find me on Twitter at twitter.com/psychosort. And I'm sure you can find that.
What's the story behind that handle?
So basically, some commentator was saying, politics is not just, sorting everyone on a spreadsheet. And I thought that was a very funny quote. That's basically it.
Fantastic. All right. Well, Brian, thank you for coming on the podcast. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. We certainly enjoyed taping it. As always, be sure to rate and review this podcast, 5 stars only on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube. Subscriptions are like through the roof these days. I think we've got like 4,500 subscribers at this point. Connor Tomlinson did really well. Who knew? It's funny how things come full circle. I was watching Sargon of Akkad videos when I was 17 years old, and now, someone he trained up is coming on my podcast to talk about what's going on in the UK. It's a funny world. Be sure to go to AmericanMoment.org. You can sign up for all of our programs. AM Fridays this summer, those are the lunches on seminal public policy topics, and the Fall Fellowship for American Statecraft. And then go to nationalconservatism.org. We have a great conference coming up here in July 8th, 9th, and 10th. We're looking forward to seeing all of the listeners of this podcast there in person in Washington, D.C. Thank you guys, as always, for listening. We will see you next week. Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier, Jared Cummings, Tiffany Kutris, and Matthew Pearson. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is AmericanMoment.org.